Rolex rules the watch world. The Daytona is the most coveted watch on the planet. Everybody wants one, but it's either a 5-year waiting list or a huge premium on the secondary market. The Submariner is the luxury sports watch standard that every other watch gets judged by. Rolex dominates, except for one area: dress watches. The Cellini, like it or not, was in Rolex terms a failure. Rolex hasn't given up though, and they're trying again with the 1908. Will they succeed? Let's get into it. Before we get to the actual watch, we're going to go through a couple of concepts that are important to wrap our heads around. Dress watches are easy to do, but hard to do well aesthetically. Now, what do I mean? Well, look at a Daniel Wellington or a Frederick Constant. Simple case, preferably around 36 to 39 millimeters, white dial, Spartan, lots of negative space, simple indices, markers and hands. Done, you have a dress watch. And yet, even for a non-watch enthusiast, most would look at those watches and think them plain, boring, stale even. Get them in your hand and you can almost feel it. The winding mechanism, if there is one, the weight, the flatness of the dial, you just notice. The reality is though, that you can't just throw money at the problem either by just adding gold cases, blued hands, enamel dials or whatever. A dress watch is by definition simple, unassuming and restrained. Do too much and you screw it up completely. Do too little and you also fail. Dress watches are Goldilocks watches to me, and finding that perfect aesthetic sweet spot when you have so little to work on is ridiculously hard. Think of a dive watch. You can have a dive watch that is ultra simple, ultra rugged, like a Unimatic, and it can still work really, really well. But you can also have a dive watch like the Royal Oak Offshore with all the bells, all the whistles, and it'll still be accepted as a good dive watch. Go overboard on a dress watch and it becomes gaudy, ugly, ostentatious, and conversely, the minimalist version is boring, lazing, or even derivative. The space within which you're working is ridiculously narrow. In the high-end, normal selling points don't work. For high-end dress watches, rational arguments around movements and specifications have little to no value. The average buyer of a Calatrava is not going to care whether or not this ornate little piece of jewelry on his wrist has Nevachrome or a silicone hairspring, or whether or not it has spirate technology. Even an automatic movement sometimes risks being, if not frowned upon, then at least not assigned as much value as you would think. For the high-end dress watch buyer, an automatic movement is potentially a screw-on lid on a bottle of wine. I mean, sorry, no, I want a cork in my bottle, thank you very much, and I will happily explain to you why a cork is always better than a hermetically sealed modern screw-on lid. Technology takes a back seat to experience and emotion. It does that with all watches to some extent, but let's be honest, if you're buying a Lange Saxonia, 200 meters of water resistance over 100 is not going to sway you. Dress watches are not hype. For all the attention that the Rolex Daytona gets, the Rolex cachet does not translate into excitement for their dress watches. Can't get a Daytona, you'll settle for a GMT. Can't get a GMT, you might settle for an Explorer. But will you settle for a Cellini? Chances are you'll be heading over to Omega or Tudor to look at a Black Bay or a Seamaster before you go for a Cellini. It doesn't matter if you're Rolex, Patek, Audemars Piguet or Vacheron. Whatever your brand has in terms of hype and street credibility, it does not rub off on your dress watches. They have to stand on their own merits entirely, or merely function as entry-level fallback options, which they often are. Which brings me to the Rolex 1908. We have a 39mm gold watch for just around $23,000 on a leather strap with a matching gold deployed clasp. It's just about 9.5mm thick. You can choose between a white or a yellow gold with black or white dials. The dials are a soft matte, no lacquer or gloss, but almost diffused compared to the matte you might see on a Pelagos or a BB58. All have numerals at the 12, 3 and 9 o'clock position and a small seconds indicator at the 6 o'clock position. Applied markers all round, sword minute hand, and a Mercedes without the Mercedes hour hand for the hour hand. There are railroad tracks on the outer rim of the dial. The crown logo is at 12 o'clock. The bezel is half domed and half fluted. The fluting being not at all as pronounced as a day date or Datejust, but more in the vein of a Globemaster, albeit with less width and less brutality in its look. But you can see the heritage of the day date fluting. The movement is the caliber 7140, a 66-hour automatic movement on display with a display case back. It has a Cellini hairspring in silicone with patented geometry, whatever that means, and high-performance Paraflex shock absorbers. Keeping in mind my 3 points, let's start with the movement. I decided to compare the 1908 to two other watches, the Patek Philippe Calatrava and the Lange Saxonia small seconds. Right off the bat, I have no doubt whatsoever that Rolex likely has the technically most capable movement. Cellini, Parachrome, patented geometry, all very technical, all very amazing. Listen to what Rolex has to say. The caliber 7140 was created by incorporating a maximum number of Rolex's existing components, then assembled following an exacting protocol of unparalleled precision. Now listen to how Lange and Söhne describe their movement. The lavishly and meticulously finished surfaces as well as the three-quarter plate in German silver express the Lange quest for perfection, just like the hand-engraved balance cock, the screwed gold chatons and the classic screw balance. And for the Calatrava, mechanically wound movement, caliber 30255p is small seconds. As the name implies, these movements are wound by turning the crown. The tensioned mainspring drives the wheels inside the watch as it gradually relaxes. Whether ultra-thin, cutaway, skeleton, simple or complicated, the manually wound movement is greatly appreciated by aficionados of traditional watchmaking. We basically have Lange saying, look how gorgeous this movement is. Patek says, this thing inside makes it tick and people like it. And then you have Rolex talking about technical specifications, tolerances, materials and whatnot. Like I said, normal selling points don't work in dress watches. I don't think the buyers of these watches care about the Rolex value proposition for their movements, Siloxy hairsprings and the lot. To the core dress watch buyer, they don't care. At least I don't think they do. Think of it this way. How many people that drive a Rolls Royce care about fuel economy? It's all down to aesthetics. I'm not an expert on evaluating movements, and I can't, like the guys at Lange, identify that Gunther hand-engraved this specific watch. As with wine, I'm more like a, this tastes good kind of guy. To me, the Lange movement is head and shoulders above the rest. I can see that with my untrained eye. The hand finishing is exquisite. The Calatrava comes in at a close second to me. Although the Rolex movement looks really good and competently put together, and I appreciate the skeletonized rotor, it comes across as put together with technical efficiency in mind, where the Calatrava has an organic flowing aesthetic that just appeals to me, and I would venture that many others would feel the same way. The Saxonia has the most basic of the three cases. Not to say that it isn't exquisitely finished, but the Saxonia stands and falls entirely on the merits of the dial, where the two others try their hand at adding some visual distinctiveness. Personally, I'm a big fan of the Clou de Paris motif on the bezel of the Calatrava. Those two rows are stunning and give this case a huge amount of appeal, where the dome fluting of the Rolex constantly reminds me of it not being the day-date fluting. I love the day-date fluting. It's iconic, but this seems more like a compromise, a half measure. An attempt to remind individuals of the heritage of Rolex, the iconic nature of the day-date fluted bezel in a more restrained version. I just don't think it works though. As for the dials, we have three clear interpretations. There's the minimalist Lange, the refinement of the Patek, and then what in the Rolex? Let's hold that thought for a second. The Lange is, like I said, minimalist. Stick indicators, argente dial with a sunray effect on the small seconds. Elongated Dauphine hands. This watch just whispers, I'm an elegant, expensive dress watch. This watch succeeds in doing the bare minimum, and because of that, it knocks it out of the park. The Patek with its railroad track in black, the small seconds with black 5-second indicators, gold indices, and slightly thicker Dauphine hands, to me says refinement. We've been improving on this watch for 100 years, and by now, it's almost perfect. With the Patek, you can see where it comes from and how it has evolved, like you can see how a Submariner, a GMT, or an Explorer has evolved over the last 60 to 70 years. Small changes, perfecting, refining. And then there's the 1908. The non-Mercedes Mercedes hands is, to me, look at this hand that is restrained, but there to remind you of our signature Mercedes hands. The fluting, look at this fluting that is supposed to remind you of the day-date bezel. The hour markers, remember how we also have hour markers on the Explorer? The superlative chronometer text is also there as if to say, remember how technically competent and superior we are to our competitors? So what to me is the 1908? If the Lange is minimalist and the Patek is refinement, well, the 1908 is telling, not showing. I'm being a little bit harsh, I know, but this is Rolex. The top dog has to get a little bit of extra scrutiny. This is a very good but slightly bland dress watch. I'm all for leveraging history where small details on a Black Bay tell a story of how it relates to the 7922 from 1954, or how the font on an Explorer today brings reminiscences of the Explorer from the 1970s. But the 1908 has no history. Rolex has history, and to me, the 1908, albeit, and I repeat, looks pretty, the inspirations, the heritage is coming from other models, and to me it feels slapped together. Visually, I would choose a Historique, a Lange, or a Calatrava over the 1908 any day of the week and twice on Sundays. The 1908 is competently put together, but the cachet that Rolex brings, like I said, from their other models, do not carry over to this model. This model, the 1908, is good, but not extraordinary. not exceptional. Not enough to stand on its own merits. More importantly, I think Rolex is trying too hard to convince us that Rolex is better than the rest and is so busy telling us rather than showing us. It's using selling points that don't work in the space. The Lange doesn't win or lose customers based on whether or not it has a Soloxy hairspring or not. It just has to be ridiculously pretty. And it is. The Calatrava owns its heritage and has heritage. The 1908 doesn't. Hi guys, Editing Mike here. I just had a thought. The 1908 is only going to be released for sale in October. So why is that significant? I don't know, and maybe this is a little bit of a conspiracy theory, but it sort of, to me, lends credence to the fact that maybe they don't believe so much in the watch, or at least they're trying to figure out and see what kind of information and feedback are they getting from the stores before pumping out X number of watches. And I know the individual ADs, they don't get to decide what allocation they get from Rolex, but they do, and especially the larger ones like Bucherer, where they have the pre-owned collaboration. I'm sure Bucherer tells them, well, we're getting lots of requests for this watch, we're getting lots of requests for this watch, but not so many for this one. And I think that's information that might be relevant to Rolex, and I think that possibly, maybe a little bit conspiratorial, but I still think in the context of the 1908, it makes sense that you wait 6 months or 3, 4, 5 months to see what the actual demand is before you start producing too many or too few. What do you think? Anyway, back to the video. Cheers. Could the 1908 be the entry model to getting on the Rolex waiting list? The Calatrava, for many, functions as one of those watches that you buy when you really want to build a relationship so you can get a Nautilus or an Aquanaut. The Saxonia to some extent too. You know what? If you want access to a double chrono or a sight work, you're buying an entry-level Saxonia at some point. The problem though is, these watches are priced as entry models in the Patek and Lange & Söhne lineup. The Rolex is 3 to 4 times more expensive than an entry Rolex. Nobody's going to buy a $23,000 watch to get on the waiting list for a $9,000 Submariner. The 1908 is a superb watch. It's supremely put together, it's well finished and technically impressive. I think it's better aesthetically than a JLC Master Ultra Thin, or it's better than an IWC Portofino in gold. But against Vacheron, Patek or Lange, it just isn't nearly as compelling or as well executed. It looks a little bit bland, a little bit of a hodgepodge and a slapdash mishmash of different ideas. All the while it suffers from this need to tell visually how much better it thinks it is, and in the end, it isn't. But like the Cellini before it, I don't see it standing on its own 2 legs, and I don't think Rolex, A, have fundamentally understood the buyers of this type of watch, and B, haven't put together something that can comprehensively compete with the high-end competition. At least that's what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe. Cheers.